For those of you who have just joined us, welcome to this public seminar organized by the Transport Studies Unit. My name is Tim Schwanen and I'm the director of the TSU, and I'm extremely excited we got Professor Jillian Anable with us today, professor at Institute of Transport Studies in Leeds, where she holds the chair in Transport and Energy. She's been doing this for the last 5 years. Previously was at Aberdeen, and over the last 10-15 years has really become the UK's leading academic working on the intersection of transport and energy. And her some of her earlier work on people's attitudes towards cars was published in Transport Policy, and it's, I would say, one of the classics in its field by now. But Jillian's expertise is much broader than that. She does a lot of work on policy evaluation and, of course, on climate change, which made her the entirely logical choice to support the organization of the Climate Assembly UK that was held in 2020, early 2020, a national level initiative that followed on the heels of a substantial number of similar smaller scale initiatives in various local authorities, where local authorities were really trying to reinvigorating their way of responding to the climate emergencies that many of them had declared. And a skeptical view would say that, well, these declarations had been made, but then people didn't really know what to do, and they thought, okay, let's see if we can bring in new understandings, new views, new legitimacy for plans we may be developing. And that's where this technique of the citizen assembly comes in, which is a very interesting technique that people perhaps know best in the UK because of the way it has helped in forcing a breakthrough in a number of constitutional issues in Ireland, the abortion question of which is the most well known. But the Citizen Assembly was much broader than that because it covered other areas as well. But the technique of the Citizen Assembly is much older and has a complex genealogy, which sort of it's known under a variety of names, not least as a citizen jury, and it's effectively a deliberative process with roots in participatory action research. And I think the first applications of it were really in the US. So I'm very excited, as I said, to have Jillian share her reflections on the National Climate Assembly in a minute. Before I do that, I want to sort of make 3 practical points. I see everyone's already muted themselves, which is great. Please try to do that throughout. If you have questions, feel free to share them in the chat, or in the Q&A part, please raise your virtual hand, your digital hand, and I will sort of try to mediate the discussion and try to give everyone the opportunity to ask a question as we can. I should also say that we are recording the presentation parts and that will later on be put on our website. I think we really need to move on to Jillian now. So please, Jillian, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Thanks very much, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. I know there's a lot of people on this, which is fantastic. I know it's going to be recorded, but I want to just start out. Maybe it's bad form too, but I want to start out with a slight caveat in that what I'm about to do is when I share my screen, which hopefully working, and Tim, you'll tell me if it doesn't seem to be happening because it's a bit difficult on Teams.
It works perfectly.
Great. Okay. So what I just want to say at the outset that this presentation, it's not a peer-reviewed paper, it's not peer-reviewed research, it's my reflections from as Tim said, my involvement primarily in the Climate Assembly, but also in some others, some more local ones. And I have found it very useful to be able to put these thoughts down. And I am quite exercised about it, if I'm honest, because I am very much involved in trying to understand what the current government position is and will be in terms of reducing carbon emissions from the transport sector. And I'm obviously involved in that in a variety of different ways. And so it's very important to me to understand how a process like this Climate Assembly has been interpreted. And so I'm going to be fairly, I'm not going to mince my words. Let's just put it that way. But like I say, these are my opinions, and my opinions could well be changed with some deliberative discussion with other people and how they interpret the whole thing. Okay, so I'm going to quickly explain what the Climate Assembly was all about, except for there are reports running to hundreds of pages from the recommendations of the Assembly, which go into more of the process, and obviously you get much more of a flavour. I'm going to outline in basic terms how the results from the transport theme of the Assembly have been put out there in their most sort of frequent and impactful form. Not put out there by me, but how they're out there and how they've been taken and the top line results sort of used. I'm then going to interpret them my way and suggest how I think they should have been interpreted. So spoiler alert there, you've already got the main essence of my critique. And then I'll go on to a few wider reflections, which actually really are just based on the fact that I've been involved and I'm still involved in quite a few local assemblies. And so I think there's all kinds of things that we could discuss about how the general population, how ordinary people are seeing some of the issues and the things that they get caught up with. Okay, so here's my tour. I've made myself a t-shirt. It occurred to me that, you know, it might be nice to have a t-shirt. So my first involvement was with one of the local assemblies in Cambridge. That's over a year now. They had a second go. They reconvened their assembly late last year as a result of COVID, and actually had one that was specifically getting people to reflect on their recommendations in the light of a sort of Build Back Better ethos. Then there was the National Assembly, the Climate Assembly, that ran in January and February last year. And subsequently, I've also been involved in similar exercises, some of them run by the same consultancy, Involve Consultancy, Lancaster, Brighton, Warwick, and the Scotland National Assembly and Thurrock. But as I say, I'm going to focus on the UK Climate Assembly. Tim has given you a good background to it. It has a slight history of its own in that it is related to the call by Extinction Rebellion for an assembly. So it was very much suggested when it was announced that it was a reaction to that demand, if you like. 6 parliamentary committees commissioned it, and subsequently each of those parliamentary committees or the committees associated with them have been going through the recommendations. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to really see how that's been discussed. That would be a great exercise, I think, to really see how each committee has actually run with it and interpreted it. As I say, the consultancy Involve ran it. They were commissioned to run it. 108 citizens finally participated in it. The methodology for gaining that sample is outlined in the reports. I would say I won't dwell on that. It started out at something like 100,000 people were randomly selected from the postcode address files with some top up in state deprived areas. And then whittled, and those people were asked to say whether they were interested that got something like 10,000 responses, and it was whittled down from there. I will just say that this is obviously not a scientific evaluation, but my attendance, which ran over 3 different weekends, I was very impressed with what I saw to be the composition and the range of views, the range of walks of life that people came from. But obviously that's not scientific evaluation. The assembly itself involved a lot of people probably on this call, a lot of people that we know and love, experts either on the academic advisory panel doing some evaluation of some of the information that was going to be given to the participants, or giving that information themselves by coming and doing presentations. Again, all the involvement of people and everything is online. And the assembly finally reported in September 2020, that should say, shouldn't it? I'm all over the place with dates. Well, let's jump straight into it with the transport recommendation. So this is a quote from the executive summary of the final report, and this is what it has to suggest of the key element of the transport theme. So it says, on surface transport, the assembly aims to minimise restrictions on travel, recommending an early shift to electric vehicles, an improvement of public transport to make it cheaper, reliable and more accessible. They also backed more local services, amenities and transport links. Well, that sounds fine, doesn't it? That sounds like job done. We're sort of doing all of that already. It's not really very exciting at all when you read that as the top line finding. What I failed to just say in the earlier slide, which I should clarify, is what my role was in the assembly. I was not one of the 4 expert leads, but I was essentially a deputy expert lead to Jim Watson, who was running the transport theme. So what my role consisted of was identifying and approaching the speakers who were going to come and give evidence to the assembly members on various different topics, policy areas. I presented myself with an overview of transport and carbon and the issues, and I designed the scenarios that you'll hear about in a minute that were put to the participants, and the individual policy instruments that were put to the participants on which they discussed, deliberated and voted. And I presented all of those scenarios and those policy options to the assembly members, and was there while they deliberated to be called over to the various deliberating groups to answer any questions on individual or whatever it might have been. So when I read this top line finding out to you, and I read that myself for the first time on September the 9th last year, I was kind of surprised, because I didn't feel that reflected really the very wide range of discussion, and as you'll see, the actual results of the voting. And as I say, job done with that, because only a month later you might think, wow, the government's actually listened already, because only a month later it did actually announce that it was bringing forward its ban on new petrol and diesel cars, which was officially standing at 2040 at the time of the assembly, although there were noises made during the period of the assembly when we were debating with people of it being brought forward to 2035. So it was a live discussion all of last year, really, and it was finally announced that ICE cars would be phased out from, or banned from 2030, and PHEVs from 2035. So as I say, it's looking like the assembly members suggest things that they were pushing on sort of pretty wide open doors, really. If you delve down a little bit deeper into the report, though, you do get a sense. Obviously, it does lay out all of the policy options that were given to the members to look at, and starts to colour in some, and give you a good bit better flavour of some of the sort of results, if you like, that were coming out. So if you just go one layer down, and that's why I call it interpretation 1.5, then straight away you get to see that the recommendations are actually quite a bit more robust. I'm not going to use the word radical at this stage, but quite a bit more robust than I would believe. So there was a recommendation for reducing the amount that we travel, and I'll go into that in a bit more. Polluting cars, e.g. SUVs, and I will go into that in a bit more detail. And the other thing that I've highlighted there is the bringing public transport back under government control. I'm not going to talk very much about that today, but it is a very significant part. It is a big topic area that people want to discuss, and it is very different to current government policy. Again, you can see some of these results in the report, not exactly presented exactly like this, but the members were asked to vote on individual policy instruments in asked to vote on them, and the results of those votes were counted in two different ways. So when they were asked to vote, they were asked to score how far they agreed or disagreed with each policy instrument, and then they were asked to give first, second, and third preferences. And so this is a graph just saying which instruments got the most first preference rankings. And what you can see from that was that quickly stop selling most polluting cars was the most popular option when counted in that way. And it was also the most popular option when you add up, called a border count. So you allocate the points for the different preferences. The first preference is then scored, given 2 points, and the second preference is given 1 point, and the third preference is given 0 points. And that's the final totting up. And again, you can see that quickly stop selling most polluting cars was the top ranked there. Government investment in low carbon buses and trains was the second, which isn't a surprise because, of course, in any public forum that any of you would have been involved with, the idea that the transport system, the public transport system, and also the active travel infrastructure should be better is a sort of no-brainer. That is an obvious thing for people to say they think should definitely happen, and it was no different in this case. But it was different in the sense that those two options were, as in the SUV banning and the public transport investment, were put side by side, and SUVs were, not only were they slightly more popular, but not really to hang up on that. We are talking about a small sample of people here, but they were they were pretty popular in the grand scheme of things. I'm going to go on to my interpretation now, though, because bearing in mind that the whole way in which this was framed to the Assembly members was in packages of policies. So although they were asked to deliberate individual policies and talk about them, make sure they understood them, what they liked, didn't like, what they thought was fair, how they thought individual policy instruments could be improved, they were ultimately asked to look at different pathways. Unfortunately, they weren't asked to look at different budgets for the future and the timelines specifically of those pathways. It was all about the end date in 2050. But nevertheless, they were asked to look at different scenarios that were made up of packages of measures that were based on expert opinion, known to be packages of measures that would just about get us there if we put things in that combination and got on with it and did it. And as I say, I designed those scenario packages. And when I would design those scenario packages, they were based on my expert involvement in many different detailed modelling exercises, which have continuously trying to understand what measures and in what package, in what combination will get us to various targets using using a budgeting methodology in each case, looking at Paris compliant pathways. And regardless of you know, all the complexities of that and all the various different instruments you could look at, it ultimately falls along two different lines. There are two ways in which we can ultimately get the carbon out of the transport system. One is to remove the fossil fuels out of all the vehicles, and the other one is to have less travelling going on in the system. And now, when we do those modelling exercises, even if we went to Herculean efforts to swap out the fossil fuels vehicles out of the system by 2030, and really went for it, you know, if we banned internal combustion engine cars from tomorrow, we still wouldn't actually achieve what we needed to achieve by 2030, based on allocating the transport sector its fair share of the budget we have as a country. So what this is depicting is that there is that trade-off, and regardless of what scenario you look at, we have to reduce the amount of travel in the system. But the earlier we get the fossil fuels out of the system, and I'm just going to focus on cars here, the earlier we do that, the less we will have to reduce our travel. So that's the trade-off, and that's the trade-off that was embedded in the scenarios, as you'll see. And it's also the trade-off which, just by the way, when I have been to other assemblies that I told you about, I put this in what I hope to be, I make this trade-off clear in every presentation that I do, and I hope it's clear, and I say it the way I said it to you, but with this sort of visual format, where I actually explain those two options, and I explain that there isn't a scenario where we don't have to do both. It's a matter of if we do the first one more quickly, we have to do less of the second. Okay, so the three scenarios. This isn't particularly helpful, but this is what they were called. So the first one was fast action to change the cars we drive. The second, changing the cars we drive and how much we drive them. And the third one, the emphasis was on the amount we travel. So that looks fairly simplistic. The first one is much more about cars and getting the fossil fuels out of them, and the green one is much more about travel, but they've all got a mixture of both. So in a slightly bit more detail, I'll go through the differences in the three. So the differences in terms of the phasing out of ICEs. The first one was 2030, so that's the most stringent or earliest. The middle one, 2032 to 35, and the last one was we can leave it up to the market, but there was a caveat with that saying we can leave it to the market, but if it doesn't look like it's going quick enough by 2030, may have to revisit whether it needs regulating. So it wasn't entirely to the market, but it was essentially sort of kicking the can down the road on any decision. In terms of stopping the sale of SUVs, that was only in the first scenario. Traffic reductions, 2% per decade per person, sorry, no, not per person, reducing traffic 2% from today's levels per decade. That went up to 5% in the middle scenario and 10% in the third scenario. All of them had no road building until at least 2045. So the participants, it was explained to the participants that no scenario to reduce carbon from the transport sector could accommodate any additional road capacity. This was the final scores on the doors in terms of voting for those scenarios. So the scenario which involved the minimum restrictions to travel were the most popular. That is the case. But the most popular scenario does involve some really quite stringent additional activities, including, of course, the banning of the sale of SUVs. It does include some restrictions on travelling and still includes no road building. I'm going to try and, there's obviously an awful lot embedded in this slide. There's a little bit more detail on this in a blog that I wrote that's on the CREDS website. But this is my attempt now to try and just explain to you why it is that I'm a little bit uneasy about some of the way the results that have been framed. So I've explained to you what the traffic reduction, indicative traffic reduction levels were, but from today's levels that were embedded in those scenarios. And they're at the bottom there, 2%, 5% and 10%. To compare those to what else is going on out there. So the blue bars there are research-based studies, different studies, all quite different studies and approaches and methods. And these are the figures for the required traffic reduction by 2030 from 2020, or in Element Energy's case, from 2015. Oh, sorry, and in Transport Quality for Life study from 2018. So slightly different start dates, but all by 2030. And there will be some other differences in those studies in terms of rate of uptake of electric vehicles that were assumed. But nevertheless, they are all studies that are really trying to push the boat out, figure out what we can do with a good emphasis on electric vehicles and sensible assumptions around the rate of uptake of electric vehicles. And those are the traffic reductions that they have come up with. So 2 studies there, the first blue one and the last blue one are national UK studies, and the middle one is for a local study for the Borough of Greenwich. And I can tell you that I know of many other studies, Scotland-based, and it's much more towards the Element Energy end of the scale, and also some other local pathway studies that have been commissioned and done. And then we have the more recent publication of the Climate Change Committee's 6th budget report and what they have assumed. I'll go into this in a bit more detail, but you can see there that what they're assuming is some traffic reduction, which is a new addition to the CCC's budget recommendations, but it's not as much. I mean, arguably, you can say there's 2 different scenarios there that I've produced for those for the CCC. It's the balanced pathway that tends to get talked about with the CCC, like any scenarios. People take the middle one, and so it's you can see the results of that there. And that's set against the Department for Transport's current, or most recently published forecast scenario. Although, as I say in a moment, the CCC was given a slightly different one with slightly less forecast growth by 2030, but it's up at around 10% forecast growth from 2020 that the DFT are assuming. In what I want to say about this, though, with the CCC report is that when you read the narrative in the CCC report, this is the way they talk about traffic reductions. So this is a quote from the report. Compared to baseline growth, we assume that approximately 6% of car miles can be reduced by 2030. Now, there has got the compared to baseline growth in that sentence, but what gets taken up, and whether it's from the BBC, Roger Harrabin, etc., is that is the 6% figure, 6% reduction figure, which isn't the case for the CCC. This is against the baseline. So actually, they're not really assuming any absolute reductions in traffic demand by 2030 in their baseline scenario. You can see this a little bit more clearly here. So the dotted line is the forecast traffic that the CCC were given for them to use and do their modelling based on. These figures, by the way, aren't published. I've asked for them from the CCC, but they gave them to me very quickly, as they were given a slightly different DFT model run. And you can see the relative, you can see the changes relative to the baseline. that the CCC have assumed there. So as you can see, you know, they do have quite a range there, as the scenarios suggest. So I'll just quickly show you the scenarios in case you haven't seen them. So the balanced pathway talks about a reduction up to 17% of miles by 2050. But when you actually look at the balanced pathway and you actually look at, flicking back to this, the orange line is the balanced pathway, and you actually look set against the baseline, it actually amounts to a 2% growth in traffic by 2050. On the roads is what will be happening. Whereas the way they actually sort of phrase it in the report, it appears like we're actually talking about quite a radical reduction in car use. And the difference between the scenarios are the degree to which the mode share, the investment in the public transport, walking and cycling systems are assumed to lead to either a shift from car use to other modes or greater car sharing. So the widespread engagement and the tailwinds have much more emphasis on what they call the behavioural side. Can't go into this at the moment though, but what is quite curious, or I understand sometimes why this has to be done with modelling work, but it needs much greater debate. What the CCC have done is they've kept the size of the car fleet exactly the same for all of their scenarios, so that there's the same amount of cars being bought and parked, etc., and made and produced and scrapped, and it's a lot. And I've forgotten what the increase in the size of the car fleet is by 2050, but it's a lot. But it's kept the same, which is obviously internally totally inconsistent. If you're going to have a lot more car sharing, a lot less car use, then effectively what their scenario suggests is that it's okay to buy these great big resource intensive assets and allow them to be even less utilised than they are at the moment. And that's the kind of thing that's not sort of discussed, and that you don't sort of pick up on when you first read the report. Your brain has to twist around all these different things. Okay, so there we have that sort of basic interpretation from the Climate Assembly report, saying, you know, that this is about minimising restrictions on travel, lots of good things to public transport, and the Climate Change Assembly also makes a lot of mention throughout its report as to the they make lots of reflections in their sixth budget report as to how they've used the Climate Assembly results. So this is one example where they say, we also consider the Climate Assembly views, which recommends a future which minimises restriction on travel and lifestyles, blah, blah, blah. So they're sort of claiming that they've really considered the Climate Assembly and used them to justify some of the ways in which they've developed their scenarios. And there is a table in the climate, the CCC's budget report, where they compare what was said in the Assembly versus what they have included in their scenarios, which is quite interesting. So the transport one there, they have picked out two things: ban the sale of new diesel and hybrid cars by 2030-35, which was the range that was in my scenarios. And that is exactly the range that they have used. And they've talked about the traffic reduction range in the Climate Assembly scenarios between 2 and 5% per decade. And they sort of make it look like theirs is greater, but of course mine made it explicit that it was from today's levels and theirs is against a baseline of growth. So there's quite a difference there. And the other thing as well that I want to perhaps have a bit more time to think about, and only really got to this the last minute preparing this presentation, is that I'd noticed a sentence in the CCC's report saying that, in the Climate Assembly's report, saying that the Assembly members had shown quite strong support for regulation in specific areas, such as mandated phase out of gas boilers. But they don't mention the sort of SUV, the support for the phase out of SUVs there. And when you look at the results, and forgive me, because I know we're talking about small numbers, and here I am looking at quantified results of qualitative, essentially qualitative information, which if I saw in a master's dissertation or whatever, I would have something to say about. But I'm trying to talk about the way these things have been presented in these very high profile reports, and is why I'm picking this out. And when you actually look at the results of the Assembly in terms of the banning of the sale of gas boilers, you have here the results from the strongly agree to strongly disagree questions that were given to the members. And you can see here, so I've contrasted the sale of banning boilers versus banning SUVs. You can see that there was a much higher agreement in the banning of sales of SUVs than gas boilers. Bit more polarisation with SUVs. You've got more people who also strongly disagree with the banning of SUVs, but you've certainly got more agreement on the whole. The same if you look at the preference counting. So you've got 53%, and with the transport, because you had so many more transport options, they spread their preference votes out over a greater number of policy instruments rather than just the 3 for the energy efficiency ones. And so it's even more impressive in a way that you've got such a much greater number of people giving that their first preference, the SUV ban versus the boilers. And then again, if you look at the board accounts, you've really got quite a contrast there. And I think this is an example of where, you know, the CCC have really majored on phasing out the sale of gas boilers. But there is absolutely no mention of large cars and the trend to large cars in the CCC report, and what maybe we ought to be doing about that. Okay, and then just to wrap up, this is my final slide, and it's a little bit random, but I just felt I wanted to share some of this with people because I have found the involvement in the local assemblies really enjoyable, actually. In fact, my most recent one was just last night with the Thurrock Climate Assembly, and again, this is of course not at all scientific. It would be great if it was, but I've found some common things coming through each time from, so what generally happens is that I'm wheeled in to do a sort of overview talk on what's the problem, what are the, you know, an overview of the sorts of solutions and the things that they might want to think about. And then I sort of am left sort of sitting when it's online, waiting for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And then they come back, they go off and deliberate in a separate online room, and then they come back and they ask me questions. Or they send questions afterwards for me to respond to in writing. One of the things I noticed first off in the very first one I did in Cambridge, and then subsequently, is a real underlying sense of anger, frustration and confusion about how public transport is funded. So one definite thing that I think needs to be thought about is that the general public do not think that public transport is subsidised at all in this country, whereas up to half the cost of each passenger that uses the bus is actually subsidised, is actually, you know, one way or another subsidy, whereas people think, and why wouldn't they, because they know private operators are operating the system and because they know that the public transport fares are expensive, that the, you know, this is entirely due to the need for profit making in these businesses. What that then also leads to is not only does it lead to public transport subsidised, you know, calls that are based in this lack of understanding, but also a resistance to have public money spent on things like bus lanes, etc., because, well, that's just going to mean that the bus companies can operate better and get more profit. And I just think that's fascinating. And I think there's something there to really sort of that we could all do with understanding the finance options and mechanisms and the flows of money within the system. But it certainly needs some way of being able to talk to people about this, which is one of the failures of this process, is that this kind of detail is just not possible. It's not possible to go into any sorts of detail with people with this kind of thing. Another big theme, electric vehicles, they're for rich people. I can't afford them. Why should we subsidise them? Why should we give people grants? It's just, you know, just going into rich people's pockets. And again, very interesting, because this is the discussion that needs to be had here is about the long game and about establishing a market, and that if we don't do this now, then they won't be available for everybody in the future. And that's a very difficult conversation to have, and a type of conversation about equity and fairness and intergenerational fairness and so on, that again, these deliberations don't have time for. As you can tell, I bang the drum about SUVs all the time, and then comes back a lot of questions about, well, why are they a problem? Some pretty, the fundamental link between bigger car equals more resources, is heavier, needs more fuel to move or energy to move, seems to need some explanation, but it does come from a real confusion about the fact that there are different. Well, SUV isn't a good category. It isn't a good category to use because there are so many different shapes and sizes and carbon footprints of the cars, and people sort of know that in a way. But what they're really asking is, is a large car versus a small car really such a big issue? It's quite difficult in this kind of forum to go into that detail and sort of put examples up and say, look, if you bought this over its lifetime, this is what would happen. Shouldn't restrictions be focused on places that are doing worse than we are? So this is a sort of a microcosm of aren't all the emissions being produced in China? It's not our fault, Gov. It's like, people in certain south coastal communities think that they're generally a much greener and more sustainable place to live than the whatever industrial northern perceptions of northern places they've got in their minds, and they think that if there's going to be restrictions, then that should be targeted to places that the naughty on the naughty step. So that's an interesting one. Yes, I can see, Tim, you want me to stop, don't you? Anyway, you can see the rest on here. The tank. I've put these on here because I think, I wanted to make the point that there is so much when you dig one layer down, that really to have a proper deliberative discussion with people, for them to consider the sorts of things we're asking them to consider, we need to know what the sort of hang-ups are that people have, what they're really quite frustrated and angry about, what their notions of fairness would be. And there just isn't time to do that. And so not only am I concerned about how the results can be cherry-picked and the trade-offs that we're asking people to make in these processes are discounted in favour of just looking at results of, oh yes, people didn't want their car use restricted, but they want more public transport. I'm concerned about that simplicity. But I'm also concerned that the process itself actually can't do justice to the debate that needs to be had in order for people to then make these considered decisions. So that's me.